Every Halloween night, the world feels just a little different. Even if you don't believe in ghosts, you kind of feel it. That static in the air when the sun drops and the trick-or-treaters take over the streets. There's something ancient hiding in the laughter and the plastic masks. Something older than candy and older than carved pumpkins. But the weirdest part is that we celebrate it like a party, when it really began as a funeral. I remember one Halloween when I was a kid, small town, dead-end street, no reason really to be scared. But I swear, every year around midnight when the porch lights went out and the wind picked up, everything went quiet, like the world was holding its breath. And I used to think that it was just me being dramatic, until I learned that Halloween was once a night when people believed that the world literally ended. And that's not poetic exaggeration. Ancient people, the Celts, believed that every year on this exact night, the barrier between life and death collapsed. The crops died, the sun retreated, and for one terrifying moment, the living and the dead shared the same road. And they called it Samhain. And they didn't celebrate it, they survived it. Long before Halloween, before Christianity, before Rome itself, there was Samhain. And it's the most important festival in the Celtic calendar, marking the end of the harvest and the beginning of the dark half of the year. To the Celts, the world ran in cycles of light and shadow, life and death. And Samhain was the moment when the balance shifts. It was both an ending and a beginning. A new year born out of the death of the old one.
Come the winter, you will die. Like flies.
Imagine standing in ancient Ireland on Samhain night, late October, cold rain searing across empty fields. Your year's harvest is safely gathered, your animals herded in from summer pastures, and the weakest ones that wouldn't survive the winter were slaughtered for meat. The world around you is dying into winter. Darkness overtakes the light as the days shrink and the bleak stillness falls over the land. The Celts believed this night was a crack in time itself. The end of one year bleeding into the start of the next, a moment when the boundary between worlds all but disappeared. In that liminal fold of time, the spirits of the other world slipped through into our realm. On this night, the souls of the dead roamed freely, and not all of them were friendly. Families welcomed the spirits of their ancestors back into their homes with warmth and hospitality, but malevolent spirits were another matter entirely. The villagers did all they could to keep those unwelcome specters at bay. They let out offerings of food and drink on their doorsteps to appease any wandering fairies or restless souls, and even set an extra place at the hearth or the table for the benign dead who might return seeking comfort. After all, on this one night, the veil was thinnest, and any spirit, good or ill, might find its way to your door. And some of these spirits are absolutely terrifying. There were the Slaw, the unquiet dead, said to travel on the wind in a screaming swarm, looking for souls to drag away. And then there was the Becuase, a shapeshifter that could turn into a horse or a man, but always with some kind of twist of wrongness. There's glowing eyes, a snarling grin, and a voice that sounded way too close to your own. And then there was the Dullahan, a headless rider, black horse, black cloak, holding his own decaying skull high in one hand like a lantern. Its eyes were always searching. They said when the Dullahan stopped riding, someone nearby was going to die. And the Dullahan might kind of remind you of, the Headless Horseman, right? And there are so many more spirits, good and bad, that Celtic lore brings to the table. Now, let me know if you'd be interested in hearing more about them. So, to guard against these supernatural threats, bonfires were lit on every hilltop. They were not the tame backyard fires we know today, but massive communal blazes meant to push back the encroaching dark. They called them bonfires on the account that they would use timber and bones from that winter slaughter to keep the fires going. In fact, that very word, bonfire, comes from these bonfires, the great Samhain pyres fed with animal bones and crops as offerings. Now, from ridge to ridge, the night was crowned with the glow of these sacred fires. Villagers gathered around them to cast the last sheaves of grain and animal bones into the flames, a final tribute to their gods offered in hope of protection through the long, dark months. A sort of gesture or suggestion saying, hey, thank you, we remember you, and please remember us kindly. These fires were treated like magical shields against the encroaching gloom. Like the summer sun made earthly, a Samhain bonfire was thought to hold back the decay of winter and burn away evil influences. Some later writers suggest that the Celts lit them as a kind of sympathetic magic, to bolster the weakened sun and to keep the forces of darkness at bay. But what we do know is that the people believed that these great fires had cleansing and protective power. And these accounts come from the 18th and 19th centuries. They describe how these fires, this billowing smoke, and even the ashes were treated as sacred tools of purification and protection. Community members would walk and even lead their animals between twin bonfires as a ritual cleansing, and let the smoke wash over them to ward off illness and bad luck. Now, one would feel safer in that circle of light, as if the wild spirits abroad in the darkness might shy away from the blinding glow of that sacred flame. When the towering bonfire finally began to burn low, each family did something strangely beautiful. As the embers hissed and glowed, it was considered good fortune to carry a piece of that sacred fire back home. One by one, people stepped forward to gather hot coal from the bonfire. They hollowed out turnips or gourds to serve as makeshift lanterns, placed the ember inside, and carried it through the darkness back to their home. These flickering turnip lanterns, the ancestors of today's jack-o'-lanterns, were often carved with grotesque, gnarled faces. Now, a famous Irish legend tells of Stingy Jack, a trickster who cheated the devil and was cursed to wander the earth with only a burning coal inside a carved turnip to light his way, thus becoming the original jack-o'-lantern. Such folktales blended Christian mortality with the supernatural beliefs, and the jack-o'-lantern became a fixture of Halloween. By carrying a grinning turnip lantern through the dark, people symbolically kept a protective light with them and perhaps frightened any demons that lurked on the lonely roads. And it wasn't until much later in America that pumpkins, native to the New World and much easier to carve, replaced turnips as the jack-o'-lanterns of choice. But back to our Celtic village. By the dim light of a single ember, those crude carvings took on life. Twisted smiles and leering eyes meant to confuse or frighten any spirit that might be drifting alongside you on the road. I mean, imagine that trek home. The air is cold and damp, and the only light is a pulsing orange glow seeping from the holes of a carved turnip in your hand. Every gust of wind makes the ember flare, projecting monstrous, dancing shadows on the mud path and stone walls. Inside your cottage, you'd set the ember lantern on the mantle, and its distorted face throws flickering shapes across the walls. Shapes that almost looked alive. In those moments, it might seem as if the dead are indeed present, their silhouettes capering in the corners of your room, deciding whether to pass you by or to step inside. And the smoke was thought to purify everything it touched and drive away any lurking evil. In Celtic practice, this kind of smoke cleansing, also known in Scots Gaelic as seining, was a common rite. The smoldering fumes from bonfires or burning herbs were used to bless houses, people, and livestock with protection. On Samhain night, as the acrid veil of smoke crept through each village, it was said to have cleansed homes for winter and perhaps even guide the wandering souls back to where they belong. And yet, despite all the bonfire's warmth and all the precautions, some spirits didn't want to leave. Some wanted in. So, to hide from these vengeful ghosts, the Celts became shapeshifters in their own right. They smeared their faces with ashes and soot from the sacred fires, draped themselves in animal skins, and donned masks made from animal heads and antlers. These disguises weren't meant to impress friends or entertain children. They were meant to fool the dead. Dressed as a spirit or a beast, you might escape unnoticed. A wandering ghost could mistake you for one of its own and pass by without bringing you misfortune. And in some villages, bands of costumed youth even went door to door in the darkness, singing ancient verses or performing little plays in exchange for food. It's an early form of mumming or guising, and that was the ancestor of today's trick-or-treating. The food offerings and performances were ways to honor the roving spirits to ensure no soul, human or otherwise, was offended enough to cause trouble. Around the flickering village fire, they carried out rituals so old and strange that even today, historians can barely piece them together. Some say there were secret chants, divinations, even sacrifices lost to time, fragments of a pagan rite that later written records never fully explain. And maybe that's the wildest part, right? We think of Halloween now as a night of make-believe, of candy and costumes and play, but for the first people who ever wore disguises on this night, Halloween was deadly serious. Dressing up wasn't about pretending to be something else for fun, it was about survival. Those early Samhain celebrants masqueraded as ghosts and animals and monsters not to celebrate the spooky, but to hide from it. They were literally trying to cheat death by blending in with the dead, praying that when unseen spirits peered into their village, they would only see fellow phantoms and move along into the night. And by sunrise, if you made it through the perilous Samhain night, you would use that cherished ember from that bonfire to rekindle your hearth flame. And this was proof that you survived the night when the world stood still. And one by one, hearths across the land were relit from the sacred flame, each home kindling its new fire from the ashes of the old year. In the first pale morning light, the terror of the dark hours finally receded. The people had passed through the final night of the old year and emerged into a new beginning, carrying a small piece of sacred light forward to sustain them through the winter. It's eerie to think that every time we light a candle inside a pumpkin or pull on a mask, we're echoing a 2,000-year-old survival ritual. We don't call it Samhain anymore, we call it Halloween. But what came between the Celtics and Samhain is where things start to get a little complicated. By the 1st century AD, the Romans have conquered Celtic territories from Gaul to Britannia. Yet instead of crushing native traditions, Rome does what it excels at: assimilation. Roman officials and settlers find Samhain strange, even savage, but also familiar in some ways. They too honor the dead and celebrate the harvest, albeit on their own terms. Over nearly 4 centuries of rule, 2 Roman festivals gradually merge with Samhain. The first is the Feralia, a day Romans traditionally set aside to commemorate their ancestors' spirits. Unlike Samhain's wild revels, Feralia is a somber affair. Families visit tombs to leave wreaths, grains, and wine-soaked bread for the departed. No ghoul-haunted forest or animal sacrifices, it's just quiet remembrance. And the second festival honors Pomona, goddess of fruits and trees, celebrated around the autumn harvest. Pomona's symbol is the apple, and now, as Roman influence spreads, Celtic Samhain feasts begin to feature sweet apples and communal games rather than just fear. Over time, Feralia and Samhain begin to blur together, especially in Roman Britain. Some Roman writings even seem to marvel at the strange hybrid festival, settlers lighting candles for their ancestors while Celtic villagers dance nearby in animal skin disguises. You can almost picture it, right? The clash of two worlds. Perhaps the Celts watched with a mix of curiosity and quiet amusement as toga-clad youths invented a new pastime, dunking their heads into barrels of water, trying to snatch apples with their teeth. And if you ever bob for apples on Halloween, well, that's probably where it began. Now, under Roman rule, Samhain slowly changed shape. The focus shifted from pure terror of spirits to a gentler remembrance of the dead, and a celebration of survival. The sacred bonfires still blazed on the hills, but now they honored beloved ancestors as much as they warded off demons. Families poured wine on graves to soothe restless souls, a tradition borrowed from Feralia, and the feast grew merrier, apples, nuts, and sweet cider from Pomona's bounty. It was still ritual, but it was also a harvest, a time of gratitude for simply making it through another year in the world where famine was never far away. So look, in short, for centuries, the Romans and the Celts lived side by side, 2 cultures with 2 calendars, 2 ways of talking to the dead. In February, Romans honored their ancestors with festivals called Feralia, a day of food, wine, and remembrance at graves of loved ones. But as the empire stretched north, it found itself in colder lands where the harvest and the hunting came much later in the year. So even though Feralia and the Celtic Samhain were seasons apart, their ideas began to blur together. Both honored the dead, both fed the spirits, and both feared what might happen if the rituals were forgotten. And slowly across centuries of mingling and marriage, the Roman way of remembering the dead began to merge with the Celtic way of surviving them. Add in Pomona, the Roman goddess of fruit and trees, whose late autumn festival celebrated the apple harvest, and you can see how the threads started to weave together. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. Soon, a new faith would find Samhain's pull too powerful to erase. As Christianity spread through the Celtic world, its leaders didn't forbid the old tradition, they reframed it. The church understood what the Celts already knew. This night wasn't just a date on a calendar, it was a threshold, the hinge between seasons and the moment when the harvest ended and the light gave way to the long dark. The church must have figured if something feels that sacred and that necessary, you can't destroy it. So the church didn't try. They simply laid their own holy day on top of it. It's a sly, quiet little takeover written in time itself. By the year 609, Pope Boniface IV was ruling over a very different world. Rome was no longer an empire, it was a memory, but the church was rising, trying to unify a scattered and fragile faith. So, Boniface established a new feast to honor all Christian martyrs, not just the famous saints, but every soul who died for the faith. It was held in May, likely to avoid conflicting with the older pagan festivals, but as Christianity spread into Britain, Ireland, and Gaul, it collided with something much older, Samhain. By the early 8th century, Pope Gregory III faced a problem. Across Europe, people were still lighting fires at the end of October, still honoring the dead, and still wearing masks. Samhain wasn't fading, it was adapting. So Gregory made a calculated move. He shifted All Saints' Day to November 1st, right on top of Samhain. The goal wasn't to replace the old beliefs, but just to reshape them, to offer a Christian version to the same emotional rhythm. Loss, remembrance, fear, and hope. It was a way to bring people inside the church instead of leaving them at the edge of a bonfire. And that night before the night of Samhain became All Hallows Eve, the evening before the hallowed. You can probably hear where this is going. All Hallows Eve becomes Halloween. The name changes, but the timing remains exactly the same. Not long after, the church added All Souls' Day on November 2nd, a quieter, more personal day for praying for every soul, not just the saints. Together, those 3 days formed a kind of spiritual trilogy. October 31st, November 1st, and November 2nd. All Hallows Eve, All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day. It was tidy, theological, and completely deliberate. I mean, you could still see the bones of Samhain under it. These new stories weren't entirely different, they just spoke them in a different language, right? Instead of spirits coming back from the other world, priests spoke of souls returning from purgatory. Instead of food left out for wandering ghosts, people now baked little soul cakes and gave them to beggars in exchange for prayers. Instead of flickering hollowed-out turnips, candlelight would light windows of chapels and cottages alike. I mean, it's kind of one and the same, right? The main idea here is that this was a time to reckon with the dead. But it never disappeared, but the tone definitely changed. What once was a night of fear became a season of remembrance. Samhain's folklore were recast as devils and demons, and the honored ancestors became souls in need of help. Where the Celts once stood guard with fire and disguise, the church now offered mass, incense, and hymns. Publicly, it looked like the old festival had been subdued, maybe even sanctified. But privately, something still lingered. People still whispered and still watched the shadows. They still left things out just in case. Because even if the church had given the night a new name, the people still remembered what it was really about. But in the 1840s, something a lot closer than death began to rot beneath the Irish soil. A tiny water mold, Phytophthora infestans. This mold swept through the potato fields, blackening entire harvests in days. For the people who lived almost entirely on that single crop, it was a death sentence. Over the next decade, nearly 1 million people would die of hunger and disease, and another 2 million fled the country, and those who crossed the Atlantic carried more than their grief. They brought their stories, their rituals, and they brought them to this new world. Tales of spirits wandering between worlds, of lanterns carved from turnips to ward off the unwelcome dead, and bonfires lit to keep the evil at bay. But in America, the soil was kind of different, and so were the crops. Turnips were scarce, but pumpkins, the big, bright orange pumpkins, were everywhere. The immigrants soon discovered that these pumpkins made perfect lanterns. They were larger, they were easier to carve, and they were able to hold a brighter light. And so, the jack-o'-lantern was reborn in America, its grinning face glowing larger and its candle shining farther across the darkness. And for a time, Halloween remained a quiet, homegrown tradition in immigrant communities. New England's strict Protestants had once shunned Halloween. In colonial days, it was nearly unknown outside of a few Catholic enclaves like Maryland. But as Irish and Scottish customs mingled with American autumn traditions, the celebration began to spread. And by the late 19th century, Halloween was catching on beyond the old country neighborhoods, and it dabbled in the occult, but stayed rooted in the harvest. Churchyard prayers and Celtic superstitions blending with barn dances and pumpkin patches. And along with the old customs came the pranks. Immigrant youth celebrated Halloween as they did back home, with mischief. In the 1880s and 90s, you might wake on November 1st to find your farmer's wagon perched on a barn roof or the outhouses tipped over in the night. As cities grew, packs of kids roamed the streets each Halloween playing tricks that grew bolder each year. And by the early 1900s, so many windows were soaped and fences trampled that the newspapers had a name for it. They called it Mischief Night. Halloween had split in two, half sacred remembrance and half teenage chaos. And what about the disguises? The old reasons for dressing up on Halloween had mostly faded, but the tradition itself endured. Generations of immigrants from Ireland, Scotland, and England had brought it with them. A simple belief that wearing a disguise could keep you safe when the spirits wandered too close. Even as cities grew louder and rowdier, many families still kept quieter rituals alive. Candles flickering in windows for the departed, or a bit of food left on the porch for luck. It wasn't exactly superstition anymore, more of a cultural reflex. A habit passed down from people who once faced the dark with ritual instead of reason. Even if no one remembered the origin, on Halloween night they still put on masks, just in case. But by the 1930s, Halloween had started to get out of hand. What was once been playful mischief had turned destructive. Now we have broken windows, stolen gates, even bonfires lit in the streets. Some cities talked about banning Halloween altogether, but instead of banning it, communities found a clever solution. Let's redirect the chaos. Parents, churches, and neighborhood groups began organizing Halloween parties, haunted houses, and costume parades to keep restless kids busy. And on those nights, every house on the street played its part. One handed out sweets, another hosted games, another offered scares. Door by door, treat by treat, the mayhem was transformed into ritual. Children quickly learned the new rule. If you dressed up and behaved, your neighbors rewarded you with candy, and that was it. The old European custom quietly evolved into something truly uniquely American. By the late 1940s, the words trick-or-treat echoed across the front porches nationwide, and Halloween had finally become what we recognize today, a night of masks, mischief, and upset tummies. By the 1950s, fear had gone commercial. Candy makers saw Halloween as a goldmine and began pushing bite-sized sweets as must-haves for the night. Buy the right candy and you won't get tricked. After World War II sugar rationing ended, companies like Hershey, Mars, and Curtis flooded the market with fun-sized bars and Halloween-themed ads promising safety for parents and popularity for kids. And the costumes came next, but not from Hollywood just yet. By the 1930s, companies like Ben Cooper Incorporated and Collegeville were already mass-producing box Halloween outfits, witches, skeletons, clowns, and generic devils. They were cheap, they were flammable, and they were made of rayon. By the 1950s and 60s, as TV reshaped American childhood, these same companies began licensing pop culture characters. You got Superman, Mickey Mouse, Casper the Friendly Ghost, even the Lone Ranger, turning Halloween into a full-blown dress-up industry. And Hollywood caught on next. Through the 50s and early 70s, specials like Disney's Trick or Treat and The Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown cemented Halloween as a family ritual. And then in 1978, fear became big business. John Carpenter's Halloween, shot for just $300,000, grossed over $70 million, proving that this holiday itself could sell horror. And that film didn't just launch the modern slasher, it turned Halloween into a marketable season for fear, Hollywood's new cash cow. And after that, the costume industry shifted again. Ben Cooper and Don Post Studios began producing licensed horror masks. Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, so the fans could literally wear the monsters that they'd seen on the screen. And what started as papier-mâché goblins in the 1930s had become a multi-million-dollar horror merchandising machine. Before long, Samhain, Feralia, and the All Hallows Eve, centuries of sacred ritual and superstition, had melted together into one big sugar-coated masquerade. The ancient Night of the Dead was now a night of costumes and candy, of laughing ghosts on television and glowing pumpkins on every porch. But here's what most people miss. Halloween never lost its meaning, right? It just learned how to disguise it. Every costume, every flickering jack-o'-lantern, every chill down your spine, it's all an echo. It's a fragment of muscle memory from when the people truly believed the dead walked amongst us. When you dress up or carve a face into a pumpkin, you're not just having fun, right? You're reenacting one of humanity's oldest survival rituals. Every generation rewrites the ritual to suit its fears. The ancient Celts lit bonfires and wore disguises to survive Samhain. The Romans left food to calm the restless dead. and medieval Christians prayed and rang church bells to drown out the whispers of wandering souls. And we here in the 21st century put on costumes, throw parties, and laugh into the shadows as if we're not afraid. But make no mistake, it's still a ritual, right? The same dance, just in a different costume. We've simply found a new spell for coping with the dark, pretending that fear isn't something that we can wear, mock, or trade for a handful of candy. That's our modern magic. Call it a celebration, and maybe the spirits watching from the dark will think we're brave. But if we start looking closely at the costumes that we choose, the masks we keep, every mask hides a truth that we're not ready to face. The ghost, our fear of death; the monster, what we might become; and the witch, the power we still don't understand. We wear these fears proudly, one night a year, and that jack-o'-lantern, that's the last ember of those ancient bonfires, still glowing after 2,000 years. It's our way of saying to the darkness that I remember you, and I'm still here. Maybe Halloween isn't the night that we pretend that the world is haunted. Maybe it's the night we finally admit that the world always was. Maybe all our masks and make-believe are just our way of whistling past the graveyard, right? Like a yearly confession that we know the darkness is real, but we've just simply learned to smile for the camera. So when your porch light flickers this Halloween, when your dog stares at that one empty corner, when that laughter fades and the darkness feels a little too deep, remember this. You're not just celebrating make-believe monsters, you're keeping an ancient promise, behaving just a little strangely one night a year to keep the real darkness at bay. Because once upon a time, on this very night, people didn't just face the dark, they invited it in. And as always, thank you for watching this video. If you want to hear more of life's histories, mysteries, or other disturbing discoveries, leave it down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And what'd you dress up as for Halloween? Let me know. Bye!